Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of True Drew Podcast. I hope you guys are having a good summer. I hope you've been able to read some good books. And actually, the book that we're covering for today's episode, I think it would make a fantastic beach read. So on today's episode, we're going to be covering The Broken Anchor, which is the 70th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it first came out in 1983. So a little fun fact about this book, the Nancy Drew computer game, Ransom of the Seven Ships, which I think is the 20th game in the series, that game is based off of this book. Now, they're completely different plot-wise for the most part. There's a few similarities, but yeah, you might like the game and hate the book, or you might love the book and hate the game. So I personally am not a huge fan of the game. If you know, you know, for obvious reasons. If not, we'll cover that when we get to that game, Ransom of the Seven Ships, later on the podcast. But I actually really loved this book, and I'll explain why when we get to my notes. But first, let's talk about some book covers. There are actually 4 separate book covers for The Broken Anchor, and I've already posted these over on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, if you want to check them out there. But the first book cover shows Nancy on this pink book with kind of green and orange motifs, and Nancy herself is standing on a beach. We can see some driftwood behind her, and you know what? I just noticed there's like a creepy guy hiding in these bushes, like near these palm trees. I had not even noticed that on the first glance at this cover till just now. But Nancy is holding, I believe it's like a medallion that plays heavily into the mystery, and she's looking at it. And behind her, there is a sunset and a ship in the background. It's very cool. It just looks like the perfect beach vacation, right? Unless, maybe subtract that guy who's spying on her. That's kind of creepy. Now, the second edition of this book cover is very different. Nancy is, instead of wearing a dress like in the first cover, she's got what looks to be like jeans, a sweatshirt, a little jacket thrown over, and she's got a flashlight, and she looks like she's in a cave somewhere. And again, she's got the medallion dangling from her hand, and there's a hand off the side of the cover reaching for her, which is kind of creepy. And this book cover edition has a tagline, and it says, "A search for pirate treasure leads Nancy into a maze of mystery and terror." Now, the third edition of this cover is kind of purple looking, and it's got some pink mixed in, and we can see a beach in the background. We're looking down like a rocky cliff, and Nancy's climbing up it, and there's this guy following her, like trying to grab her ankle. This may be Tom or Jack, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. But there's a tagline on this book cover edition, and it says, "Nancy heads for a holiday in the sun and falls into a sinister trap." And the fourth and final edition of this book cover shows Nancy with this guy who's got her in a headlock, and she's kind of got one arm up like she's trying to, poke his eye out or get out of this headlock situation she's found herself in. And there's some water and palm trees and a silhouette of a ship, but I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the UK Nancy Drew covers. I just look at them, and every time I look at them, I'm like, did you guys try at all? I don't know. Like, I think the American ones are so much better, but that's just me. So I came up with a couple funny cover spoofs, and I used the first book cover as an example, the one where Nancy's on the beach and there's a ship in the background, and I said just Nancy of the Caribbean. I just had to because, technically she goes to the Bahamas in this book, not the Caribbean, but I was a huge Pirates of the Caribbean fan, and so the whole time reading this book, there's a medallion and there's ships and there's pirate lore, and so I loved all of that. Now it's stuck in my head. Also, I was second guessing myself. I was like, is the Bahamas a part of the Caribbean? So, according to Google, although the Bahamas is considered to be part of the Caribbean, it is not geographically in the Caribbean. That's kind of confusing. Now, the second funny cover spoof that I came up with, I used the cover where Nancy's climbing up that rocky cliff face, and I just said, Nancy's fallen and she can't get up. So, when it comes to giving these book covers a rating, I would probably give them 4 magnifying glasses, except for the UK edition, because, not my favorite. I would probably give that one a 1. I think I always give those a 1. They're just not, I don't know, they're lacking to me. Also, before we jump into the rest of the episode, I wanted to say congratulations to Moira for winning a copy of The Broken Anchor. I hope you enjoy it and get to read it this summer, and I hope that it's a great addition to your Nancy Drew book collection. Also, if you're not following me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast, you should be, because a lot of times I do giveaways and I give away free books. So now, without further ado, let's jump into discussing the characters that we see in The Broken Anchor. So first up, we have a guy named Sheriff Boyd, and Nancy encounters him in Miami while she stops off there before she goes to Nassau. There's Jeff and Lena Defoe, Avery Yates, who's a jeweler, Mr. Perkins and Mr. Graves, who are some seaplane passengers, Tom and Jack, which I keep wanting to say Tom and Jerry, but anyway. There's also Penny Defoe, who is Jeff and Lena Defoe's granddaughter. So now really quickly, I'll go ahead and read a synopsis for The Broken Anchor. When Nancy Drew learns that she has won a holiday for two on an island resort, she is completely mystified because she has never entered any contest for such a prize. Her suspicions grow when an abandoned boat linked mysteriously to her and her father is traced to strangers at the same resort. More than ever, Nancy realizes she must contact her girlfriends Bess Marvin and George Fain, who have gone to the island ahead of her. But unable to reach them, the young detective finds herself on the brink of yet another intriguing mystery involving a strange old medallion and a long-lost treasure. Now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Invitation to vacant resort leads Nancy Drew to pirate treasure. So now let's go ahead and jump into discussing the notes that I took down while reading The Broken Anchor. So our mystery starts with Hannah handing Nancy the mail, and she asks what she won, and Nancy opens this piece of mail, and it's a letter that says contest winner, and it's from a place called Sweet Springs Resort in the Bahamas. But the weird thing is, Nancy doesn't remember entering a contest. Now, the illogical part of me wants to go, whatever, it's a free vacation, like, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, like, go take the vacation, Nancy. But the logical part of me and the logical part of Nancy is just like, this is kind of weird. I didn't enter anything. This might be a scam or something, so maybe we should look into this before we go packing our bags. But Nancy inspects this letter a little bit closer, and it says that she's won a week-long vacation stay courtesy of the resort and plane tickets. So while she's looking at this, Bess and George show up and they witness Nancy inspecting it. So George makes the comment that sometimes resorts in the Bahamas close in the off season, which it's really close to being at the start of this story, and so she's a little bit suspicious, and Nancy is too, so she calls her travel agent to confirm that the plane tickets are real, and they are. They're bought and paid for. And again, I say, why can't this happen to me? So about this time, Nancy gets a call from Carson, who has gone to Miami on a case, and she tells him about the contest winnings, but he says he's going to need her help, and maybe she can give the perks to Bess and George instead. And Carson also says that they can join Bess and George after they finish wrapping up the case. So he explains that he's working with people in Miami to locate the owners of an abandoned boat, but it gets weirder. According to the authorities, there were a bunch of newspaper clippings found on this boat of cases that Nancy has helped Carson solve. That's really weird. So Nancy flies down to Miami with Bess and George, and she sees them off to Nassau. So they get on the plane and they wave goodbye to Nancy, and Nancy and Carson talk to the sheriff down in Miami about the abandoned boat. And the sheriff asks Nancy if she recognizes it. Now, I know this Sheriff Boyd guy is trying to do his job, trying to turn over every stone, and there were a lot of newspaper clippings about Nancy found on the boat, but it's like Nancy comes from River Heights. It's landlocked, okay? Like, she lives on a river, but like, what makes you think she's seen this boat at all in her life? So she says, no, I don't recognize the boat, and he gets agitated when she doesn't. And it's like, okay, just because there were a bunch of newspaper clippings about the cases Nancy has solved doesn't mean she knows the owners of the boat. Like, have we ever heard of stalkers? These people could have been stalking Nancy. which is very concerning. Also, after Nancy and Carson talk to Sheriff Boyd a little bit further, it turns out that he has actually already traced the owner's names of the boat by looking up an appliance purchased on the boat. So I think he found a refrigerator or a stove or something, and he was like, oh, a Jeff and Lena Defoe owned this boat. So it's like, if you were so certain of that, why harass Nancy? She's just an innocent bystander. But according to Sheriff Boyd, the Defoes own a resort on Anchor Island in the Bahamas, which is where Bess and George are going. So the sheriff lets Nancy and Carson search the boat to see if they can find any clues that he couldn't, I guess. And so Nancy asks her dad if they should tell Sheriff Boyd about the mysterious contest that she won, and he says yes, but the sheriff gets a call on his radio and he has to leave, so they'll just go to his office later, Carson says. So Nancy and Carson split up to search the ship's cabins, and Nancy loses an earring that rolls behind a bed, and in the process she finds her earring and a secret compartment with a leather pouch inside of it. And inside this leather pouch is an old gold medallion, and Carson says he knows a jeweler named Avery Yates who can look at it for them, but they should show it to the sheriff first. And then Nancy says, Sheriff Boyd didn't find it. When I read this, I was like, Nancy Drew, you're turning out to be quite the rebel. Because normally I feel like Nancy would be like, I have to follow the procedure of the law and I'm going to show this to the sheriff first. But here she's definitely not doing that. So I feel like the further we get into the paperback books, Nancy does things like this that aren't exactly out of character, but it's just different from the original 56 books. So Nancy and Carson again start to speculate about this couple, the Defoes, that own the boat. And they also start to wonder about something that Sheriff Boyd said about the location of the boat. He made this comment that the inlet was an odd place to leave the boat because they couldn't just walk off, so maybe somebody met them and they left together from there. So there's just a lot of weird things going on here, some things that are at play that Nancy and Carson don't yet understand, and that's one thing that I will say that I love about this book. This book does a great job of building suspense, and it's one of the best examples of this that I've seen in the series so far. It's just eerie. You're wondering, why did Nancy win this contest? Was it for some other ulterior purpose? Who is luring Nancy to this island? So when Nancy and Carson get back to the hotel they're staying at, they have no messages from Bess or George, which is odd because they should have already been at the resort in the Bahamas at this point. So they try to put some calls through, but the switchboard operator says the calls go to the resort, but it's like the phone just keeps ringing. So Nancy rests for a few minutes at Carson's insistence because she's really worried about Bess and George, and then Carson informs her that Avery, the jeweler that he knows, has invited them to dinner. So Nancy asks if they can eat at the hotel so they won't miss a call from Bess and George, and Carson says Avery will be fine with that. Also, I think that it's so cool that my name showed up in a Nancy Drew book. I didn't know if that would happen. I feel like my name is a lot more common these days than it was when I was, growing up in the 90s, but very cool. It's in the form of a nearly 80-year-old man character, but hey, we'll take what we can get. So Avery Yates shows up and he looks at the medallion that Nancy found on the boat, and it's on a chain, and he says that it's most likely a Spanish coin and possibly from a sunken galleon, and it may have even been confiscated pirate treasure. So how it factors into this mystery, though, remains to be seen. So Nancy, Carson, and Avery have dinner, and then he takes the coin to try to do some resurfacing to it because it's kind of got a rough side to it, and it looks like there's something written on it, and he's like, maybe I can see what's engraved on it if I take a closer look. And then when Nancy and Carson get back up to their room, Nancy is dismayed because there have still been no calls from Bess or George. So the next thing to happen is Sheriff Boyd angrily calls the Drews in the early morning hours the next day because the boat has now gone missing. It's no longer in the inlet where they left it, and he comes to see them, and he basically accuses them because they were the last to see it. But it's funny because Carson reminds Sheriff Boyd, he's like, that would be dumb for us to have done anything to the boat because we would naturally be the first people that you would suspect. They also tied the boat down and they locked it up before they left, so he's like, we didn't do anything to it. I feel like all of this comes down to the fact that Sheriff Boyd just doesn't want to do his job. He's annoyed that this boat showed up in his area, and he's mad that he's having to deal with it. but now Sheriff Boyd is really suspicious of them, and he wants them to come to the station later to give a timeline of where they went after seeing the boat. And Nancy now thinks it would be unwise to say anything about the medallion. Yeah, I would say so. But right after this, Nancy finally gets a call through with the operator to Anchor Island to the resort, but the man that picks up the phone is unfriendly and says the resort is closed and no one named Bess or George are there. And then the line goes dead. This book is so suspenseful. And the next note that I wrote down is just Sheriff Boyd is the absolute worst because Nancy tells him about the contest and the fact that her friends are missing and she's assuming the worst. And he's still more worried about this stupid boat than 2 missing girls. So annoying. But Carson talks to people by phone at the Nassau airport, and there's a flight attendant that can confirm that she remembers Bess and George and says they were met by a man wearing boating clothes. So their plane made it to the Bahamas, and there was someone who picked them up, presumably from the resort, even though the person on the phone at the resort said Bess and George weren't there. So Nancy and Carson are extremely worried by this point, so Carson charters them a seaplane to Nassau, and they go to pick up the medallion that they left with the jeweler, Avery. So Avery was able to smooth out the rough edges on the medallion, and on one side it looks like there's a broken anchor symbol. So next, Nancy and Carson go to get on the seaplane, and the pilot is very rude to them. And there are also 2 other men aboard, a Mr. Graves and a Mr. Perkins. And it's kind of strange because the Drews thought that they would have the plane to themselves. You know, when you charter a seaplane, normally I think they would give you a manifest or something and be like, oh, there's, other passengers on board, or no, it's just you. But that's very weird. And Mr. Perkins answers Nancy when she asks if he knows the Defoes, and he says he's been fishing with them on their boat, the Polka Dot, before. And he also says that Sweet Springs Resort is normally closed this time of year. So Nancy and Carson disembark once the seaplane lands, and Nancy sees movement on a hill, and it's George. And she runs down, and Nancy hugs her because she's just relieved to see her friend at this point. This has been a very traumatic ordeal. And behind them, the seaplane takes off and flies away, and that's when George tells them they're stranded there. The resort is closed and only someone named Penny is there, and the phones and radios don't work. So Nancy asks where Bess is, and George says she went for a walk earlier, but they haven't seen her in a while. And Penny comes down to the beach and introduces herself as Penny Defoe, and Jeff and Lena are her grandparents. So Penny got to the island just a few days ago, and she found a note there telling her to make herself at home, and it was from her grandparents, but there was nothing else in the note saying, hey, we're going away for a little while and we'll be right back. Nothing. And then George picks up the story and continues and says a man named Tom picked them up at the airport and was not happy when they learned that Nancy Drew wasn't with them, but he did drop Bess and George off by plane and then he left. So Nancy and George split up at this point from Penny to go look for Bess, while Carson tries to get the radio working so they can communicate with the outside world. And Nancy finds a scrap of blue fabric on a bush, and she recognizes it as coming from Bess's skirt, one of her favorites, according to Nancy. So they follow the rocky coastline, but they don't see Bess, and Carson can't get the radio working. And then Penny tells them that sometimes no one comes to the island for weeks during the off season. I don't know about you, but I think I would be properly freaking out at this point because, yeah, you're on a beach, it's really pretty, but you're stranded there. Like, any beautiful place can be like a prison with the right tone and atmosphere. And it's like they can't communicate with anybody. Are they going to have enough food? Like, this is a bad situation. So Nancy and George talk back up at the resort while preparing dinner, and they speculate about Penny's grandparents, the Defoes. And Nancy says it makes no sense that the Defoes would invite Penny and then just leave. So as they're in the kitchen, Nancy and George hear a scream, and they go investigate it, and they find Penny and Carson staring at the radio phone, which is broken. And that's when Carson says he thinks they're not alone. So Carson had actually been making a little bit of headway on fixing the radio, and then he left the room for a few minutes, and then they come back and it's in 2 or 3 pieces. And it's like, that would be so creepy to know that somebody's She's watching your every move, and they're sabotaging your attempts to communicate and get help. Do you see what I mean? Like, this is great storytelling. So everyone locks up the resort that night for their own safety, and they've decided to search for poor Bess the next day because it's too dark to go back outside, and they're kind of freaked out about the fact that someone has been in the resort without their knowledge. And they make sure that no one's inside the resort with them before eating dinner and locking all the doors, which I was like, okay guys, good. That was a good idea. That was a smart move, because the last thing we need to happen is another horror movie type scenario where somebody like comes into their rooms while they're sleeping. So after dinner, Nancy shows Penny the medallion, and she gasps out loud, and she says her grandfather told her a story about a missing Spanish galleon and pirate treasure, but she thought it was just a legend. So she now knows for a fact that the boat Nancy and Carson searched was her grandparents, the Polka Dot. And I don't think the book was super clear on this, or I've been super clear on this, but I guess the name of the boat was somehow hidden or tampered with because whoever stole it didn't want people to know that it was the Defoes. So anyways, according to the legend, a ship went missing and it was assumed that a pirate stole it, according to Penny. And while Penny's telling them this story, the power goes out. So she finds candles and hurricane lamps and turns them on, and she says the wires were most likely cut. So someone is watching them from outside the resort. Ugh, that gives me chills. And Nancy's also convinced that whoever cut the power probably has Bess, and they may be after the medallion. Poor Bess. So the group covers the windows with fabric, with like curtains and stuff, and sheets. And Nancy slyly hides the medallion in a loaf of frozen bread because no one will think to look for it there. Which, you know, yeah, I wouldn't look for a piece of pirate treasure in a loaf of bread. So the next morning, Nancy and the group go downstairs and they see that the resort safe and desk have been searched. So someone got in the resort while they were sleeping. Ugh. Like, it's so creepy. So Nancy finds out from Penny that the resort was unlocked when she arrived, meaning that someone else has keys. So it was pointless for them to lock up anyway. Now, after this, Nancy, Penny, Carson, and George explore what Penny calls the village, which is really just homes where the staff lives when the resort is open. So they're deserted and there's no sign of Bess, but they do find a receipt for groceries and supplies that were left at the dock, which are no longer there. So someone took them. This quote-unquote vacation just keeps getting worse and worse. So the group splits up and Carson and George work on the radio together, and Nancy and Penny go in separate boats to go fish to catch some stuff for dinner. And Nancy catches several fish, and then while she's out there, she spots the Defoe's boat, the Polka Dot, the one that her and Carson searched back in Miami. And as it disappears around the island, Nancy notices she's in a strong current and water is rushing over her feet. So her boat is sinking. Oh, look, another boating mishap within a Nancy Drew book. You like that? I think that was pretty catchy. So Nancy rows furiously to shore and she makes it somehow by some miracle, but she pulls the boat out to look at it and finds a perfectly drilled hole, too perfect to be an accident, and she wonders if it was plugged with something that dissolved over time. So someone intentionally sabotaged her boat and they made it to where she wouldn't notice that it was sinking until she was too far out in the water. Ugh. I know I've said that a lot in this episode, but like, I have to say it again because these villains are diabolical. And I love it. So Nancy runs into Carson and she gives him the cooler of fish, the fish that she caught while she was out in the boat. And she's telling him what happened and about seeing the polka dot out in the ocean. And Carson, who was standing near the cove and should have seen the boat, never did. And it never left the cove, but it isn't in the cove now. So where did it go? So Nancy and Carson go back to the resort to make dinner, but Nancy wants to get the boat to repair it because she just left it down there on the beach. But when they go back, her boat is gone, and a man's footprint is in the sand where it was. So Nancy and Carson are baffled as to why someone would sail the polka dot to Miami, Florida, abandon it, then bring it back to the resort. They're like, why would they do that? That makes no sense. But they also talk about how Penny's boat wasn't damaged, but Nancy's was. And I'm not gonna lie, at this point in the story, I started to become very suspicious of Penny. Actually, I was kind of suspicious of her when they showed up and she was there too. I mean, she could be lying. They don't even know this person. What if she's like an obsessed stalker and she's obsessed with Nancy, and that's why they found all those newspaper clippings on the boat? Like, that would make an excellent like horror type mystery. That's not what happens, but anyways, if I rewrote it, that's what would happen. But Penny is not a villain in this story. Sorry to disappoint you if your mind went the same way that mine did just now. So anyways, later that night, Nancy, George, Penny, and Carson decide to light a fire in hopes of getting someone on a neighboring island's attention. And Nancy goes up the road a ways to make sure that no sparks are carrying. And she gets too warm standing by the fire. And when she does this, she gets grabbed from behind. So Nancy's captors are two guys named Jack and Tom. And they haul Nancy into a raft. And Nancy finds out by listening to them that they have Bess and the Defoes somewhere, and they're looking for the medallion and this pirate treasure. Finally, an update on Bess, but Nancy is able to roll out of the boat and swim away when the guys get distracted by a wave, and Nancy finds herself in a weird slip of a cave off the cove where she saw the polka dot, and she hears George calling her name. So Nancy's able to climb up and get back to George, and she tells her what happened as they go back up to the resort. So Nancy's worried about the location of the medallion, so she checks on it to make sure that it's still in that loaf of bread. And again, while she's looking at it, she thinks that one side looks a lot like a broken anchor. And the island that they're on is called Anchor Island. So you see where I'm going with this? So anyways, Penny takes some tracings of the other side of the coin, and Nancy makes out an upside down V and thinks that it might be symbolic for the cave that she saw earlier. And she also thinks there may be underground caverns under the resort. So at this point, Nancy, George, Penny, and Carson go find the cave Nancy mentioned, and they hear shouts, and they find Bess, finally, and the Defoes, who were about to drown behind a latched door. Ugh, poor Bess, poor the Defoes. So the group goes to the resort, and everyone tells a story, and the Defoes were approached by these two men, Jack and Tom, and the couple was friendly to them, but the two men kidnapped them. And then Bess also says that they kidnapped her when she saw their boat. They didn't want her to report back to the others. So the Defoes actually did send for Nancy. She did actually win that vacation. I think they were hoping she would come and solve where this treasure was, but Nancy says she thinks the medallion is the key that Tom and Jack have been looking for. So next, Nancy sees the polka dot tossing in the cove during a storm, and the next morning it's beached, and Nancy sees Tom and Jack sneaking away from a cabin. So Nancy gets Tom and Jack to chase her, and then Carson holds them at axe point. Go Carson. And everyone ties them up, and they use a radio to call the authorities. And at the end of the book, Nancy locates the pirate treasure in the sea cave. So next, let's go to a little segment of the podcast that I like to call What's Cooking. So in this book, we saw mentionings of iced tea and sandwiches, ice cream and brownies, casserole, blueberry pancakes and ham, salad and fish, and hot cocoa and cookies. Now on to the things that I think that Nancy could add to her resume. So I just said that Nancy could consider herself a pirate lass because she found this pirate treasure, and if that's not cool, I don't know what is. Now onto the things I liked and didn't like about the broken anchor. So the things I liked, this book had an immaculate beach setting. Like if you're looking for a book that makes you feel like you're at the beach but you're not actually there, read this book. It was great. I also love the suspense in this book, and there's treasure, so what's not to love? And really, the only thing I didn't like, I thought we could have used some more pirate lore. I would have loved to have gotten some more names of pirates that were, in these legends supposedly. Like, they don't even have to be real pirates, but I wanted some more swashbuckling and stuff. Like I said, huge Pirates of the Caribbean fans, so if there had been more elements of that, I would not have complained. So when it comes to giving this book a magnifying glass rating, I would give it 5 magnifying glasses. This was a very different mystery. I enjoyed the setting, I loved the characters, and the suspense. Like, I don't know, like usually in Nancy Drew books, there's a little bit of suspense at the end of a chapter. This was just like bam, bam, bam. Like, it never let you let your guard down, I guess. So that's what I really liked about this book. So that concludes today's episode. For next week's episode, we're going to jump into another book, The Silver Cobweb. And if you like opera singers who just happen to be divas and jewelry that has insects in it, like in the Spider Sapphire mystery, then you're definitely not going to want to miss this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.